In February 1959, 9 young Russian hikers perished during a cross-country skiing trek through the northern Ural Mountains. All were very experienced, so investigators were mystified about why the hikers had cut their way out of their tent in the middle of the night and fled into the wilderness to their death. Until today. Last year, two scientists published their hypothesis that the group had been surprised by a sudden slab avalanche. Now, those scientists are back to address the concerns of their critics in a recent paper published in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment. The Dyatlov Pass incident, as it came to be known, takes its name from the 23-year-old radio engineering student who organized the expedition, Igor Dyatlov. A mountain pass near the site was later named Dyatlov Pass as a memorial. He and his fellow travelers, 7 men and 2 women, were students at the Ural Polytechnical Institute, as it was named in those days. The group originally consisted of 10 highly experienced hikers who were, with one key exception, all students and recent graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute. The odd one out was Semyon Zolotaryov, a last-minute addition to the group and at 37 years of age, was conspicuously older than the others. Another member, Yuri Yudin, also looks suspicious, turning back on January the 27th because his rheumatism had flared up and the knee and joint pain was too severe to continue. He was the only one of the original 10 that survived. The rest carried on, taking photos of each other, lurking about and recording diary entries that expressed their excitement. "I wonder what awaits us in the trip," one wrote. "What will we encounter?" They were excited about the adventure to come. According to diaries and camera retrieved from the ill-fated campsite, the hikers began to move through the pass on the morning of February the 1st. Their goal was to set up camp for the night on the other side. But they lost their bearing because of snowstorms and poor visibility, ending up further west on the eastern slope of Kalat Shakil. Rather than backtracking to set up camp in a forested area just under a mile down, the team opted to dig a cut into the slope and pitch their tents there for the night. Dyatlov maybe didn't want to lose the altitude they had gained during the day, so he made that choice. The group was expected to return home on February the 12th, and friends and family initially assumed the part had just been delayed. But as the days passed and weeks passed, relatives requested a search and rescue party. On February the 26th, rescuers found the abandoned tent half torn down and covered in snow. The hikers' shoes and belongings were still inside. The tent had been ripped open from within, and 9 sets of footprints led down to a nearby wood. Rescuers found the first 2 bodies, Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Dorochenko, under a large Siberian pine. The men were shoeless and in their underwear next to the remains of a very small fire. 3 more bodies were found between the pine tree and the campsite, Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogrova and Rustam Slobodin. The position the bodies were found in suggested that they were trying to get back to the tent. Rescuers needed a full 2 months to find the last 40 members, Lyudmila Dubineva, Alexander Kuletov, Nikolai Thibault and Semyon Zolotaryov, since the bodies were buried under 13 feet or close to 4 meters of snow in a ravine within the woods. All 9 of them escaped on foot from the tent. Some were found in the forest and some buried in 4 meters of snow. The medical examination of the first 5 bodies concluded all had died of hypothermia, although some had weird injuries. Slobodin had a small crack in his skull, but it was deemed not fatal. And the 4 bodies later discovered seemed to tell a different story. 3 had suffered fatal injuries. Thibault Briniel's body had major damage to the skull, while Dubinina and Zolotaryov had major chest fractures, all requiring a force comparable to a car crash. Yet, there were no external wounds that could be linked to the bone fractures. The heads and faces of these 4 had also gotten a good deal of soft tissue damage. Zolotaryov's body had no eyeballs, Kuletov was missing his eyebrows, and Dubinina's body was missing the tongue, eyes, part of the lips, and some facial tissue. These gruesome injuries were suffered post-mortem, and all victims died somewhere during the night, 6 to 8 hours after their last meal. Over the ensuing decades, plenty of theories have been proposed to explain the tragedy. The Mansi Theory. Early on, it was theorized by Soviet authorities that the Dyatlov party may have been killed by the Mansi, an indigenous people of the region. The idea that the hikers were slaughtered for straying onto sacred land or perhaps as part of a shamanic ritual persisted for some time. Much was made about the presence of a Mansi chum or dwelling in the vicinity of the hiker's tent. We often see Mansi signs on the trail. I wonder what they write about. Zinaida noted in her diary, while one of her fellow hikers, we don't know which one of them, also recorded that Mansi writings appear on trees, all sorts of obscure mysterious characters. Still, this has been roundly debunked as a baseless theory rooted in a misunderstanding of Mansi culture and rituals. And if they were indeed rounded up and murdered, why were the bodies found in different locations, some with more injuries than others? The initial suspects, the indigenous reindeer herders, were also not to be found in the area. Only the hikers' footprints had been found, and the force of the blows and lack of associated soft tissue damage was inconsistent with a violent attack of any kind. The Espionage Theory. Two members of the Dyatlov group have been the focus of particular speculation. Why was Semyon Zolotaryov, a 37-year-old veteran of World War II, attached to this group of young students and graduates? Furthermore, is it significant that a few years earlier, Yuri Krivonishenko helped clear up a radioactive leak at the secret Soviet nuclear facility, an incident which has since been compared to the Chernobyl disaster, but with less media coverage? According to one theory, Zolotaryov and Krivonishenko, and potentially a third unknown hiker, were working for the KGB and had joined the Dyatlov trek to rendezvous with CIA agents in the Ural Mountains. While handing over radioactive materials and fake nuclear secrets, the Russians were supposed to take photos of the American agents. The theory goes that the CIA men got wise to what was going on, leading to a fight breaking out and the eventual massacre of the Dyatlov party. The UFO military weapons theory. In 1990, Lev Ivanov, the man who led the initial investigation into the incident, published a sensational article claiming he'd been ordered to censor some of his key findings, in particular the unusual char markings on trees near where the bodies were found, which in Ivanov's view confirmed the source of heat ray that had been purposefully aimed at some of the helpless hikers. His article also alleged that floating balls of light and other weird phenomena had been reported over the Ural Mountains in February, and Ivanov doesn't mince his words, saying that based on the evidence gathered, the role of UFOs in this tragedy was quite obvious. Whether these supposed UFOs were of alien origin or were experimental Soviet weapons depends on which version of this theory you believe. Yeti Theory. The idea that the group was killed by a Yeti rests on a few pieces of dubious evidence. The first is a photo taken by one of the doomed hikers, which shows a dark humanoid figure seemingly sculling by a tree. But was this a monster or simply a blurry image of another hiker? The second item, cited by pro-Yeti theorists, is a parody newspaper the hikers wrote during the expedition, which contained the line, "The Yeti lives in the northern Urals, near Mount Orthodon." While this was clearly intended as a joke, other stories in the parody newspaper were exaggerated accounts of things the hikers really did or encountered. So, according to this theory, the satirical entry on the Yeti was inspired by a real sighting of the creature which stalked and eventually ended up killing the entire group. Were they after the Yeti from the get-go? We will never know. And finally, the Slab Avalanche Theory. The most widely accepted theory is also the most mundane. The group fled the tent because of a slab avalanche, then succumbed to the harsh conditions. A slab avalanche is where a compacted block of snow slides down a slope when the underlying weaker snow gives way. According to this theory, a combination of factors, including mountain winds and the weakening of the mountain snow during the pitching of the tent, led to the avalanche. The thinking goes that once the avalanche hit, the group slashed their way out of the tent in a panic, with some of them severely injured by the impact. This would explain broken ribs suffered by Zolotaryov and Dubinina, and the ones who escaped with mild cuts and abrasions, which still weren't killed by injuries and were able to live on their own. The ones who escaped with mild cuts and abrasions helped the others flee what they assumed was the danger zone for a full-scale avalanche, only for the whole group to perish from the intense cold or their injuries. They imagined that was the first phase of a larger avalanche, not just a few shovels of snow. Alternatively, all 9 hikers may have escaped the crushed tent without serious injuries, which would explain why there were no tracks in the snow, suggesting people had been assisted or dragged. The rafter succumbed to the cold by the tree, 3 froze to death trying to get back to the tent, and 4 others died by the ravine, with some being badly injured by the avalanche, which is unlikely because it wasn't a large avalanche, or were killed while trying to create a snow shelter. The gruesome facial damage could have been the result of animal scavengers and decomposition. Many Dyatlov commentators are skeptical, and the finer details of the Slab avalanche theory are hotly debated. Ultimately, though, it remains perhaps the most plausible explanation of what befell the explorers that cold, bleak night in 1959. Still, none of these theories was deemed especially satisfactory, and the original investigation merely concluded the hikers' deaths were due to a compelling natural force that the hikers were unable to stop. And this leads us to 2019, when the investigation reopens. In 2019, the Russian Public Prosecutor's Office resurrected the case from its archives, and that's when Johann Gom, who heads the Snow and Avalanche Simulation Laboratory at Eiffel in Switzerland, received a call from a New York journalist looking for insight into the mystery. The call was the first time Gom had heard of the Dyatlov Pass incident, and he was immediately intrigued. After spending a few days thinking it over and doing calculations, Gom told the journalist that he believed the most likely explanation was an avalanche that hit while the hikers were sleeping, catching them by surprise. The Russian prosecutor's office had reached the same conclusion. Given the lack of evidence and the various strange elements in the case, Gom decided to partner with Alexander Pazrin, a geoengineer in Zurich, to investigate more deeply. The 2 men combed through the public archives, consulted with other scientists, and ultimately developed 2 distinct models to reconstruct the avalanche they believed had occurred in February 1959. Gom and Pazrin published their findings in January 2021. The duo attributed the Dyatlov Pass tragedy to a slab avalanche. They concluded that it did not occur until several hours after the Dyatlov group had made a cut in the snow-covered slope to set up camp. The most crucial factor was the influence of katabatic winds, which carried air down the slope under the force of gravity. Those winds caused the snow to accumulate uphill above the tent, which is one of the required elements for a slab avalanche. It was not a lot of snow, just enough to scare them. Pazin said that was the initial trigger, but that alone wouldn't have been enough. At a certain point, a crack would have formed and spread, causing the snow slab to release, and the conclusion was that if they hadn't made a cut in the slope, nothing would have happened. The 2021 paper naturally generated media interest. Gom and Pazrin recalled that their phones almost never stopped ringing for weeks. They admitted that media interest was rewarding at first, but the attention became harder to deal with over time. Most of the coverage was positive, except in Russia. In the Russian popular science press, you had positive coverage, but the general interest and tabloid press were considerably more negative and skeptical of the avalanche hypothesis. Mysteries are more attractive while unsolved, or at least not solved with a boring scientific explanation, the authors wrote. Still, even this theory has issues. There are 2 common objections the researchers faced. First, the slope wasn't steep enough. Second, the conditions weren't quite right to trigger an avalanche. There was no snow cover on the slope, no wind that night, and no evidence of any significant snow transfer by wind. Further, local residents insisted that they had never seen signs of an avalanche on the Dyatlov Pass. Gom and Pazrin set to work to address the questions, and with the help of a leading snow avalanche researcher at Moscow State University, Viktor Popovdin, they confirmed that the snow measurements he made during a 2019 winter expedition to Dyatlov Pass were consistent with the assumptions Gom and Pazrin used in their models. Another scientist confirmed that on February 1st and 2nd, 1959, the snow cover above the tent was greater than 1.5 meters, also consistent with the model, and another scientist confirmed that the wind over the tent was 9 to 12 meters per second, right in the range required to explain the observed delay in the Slab avalanche release in the model, the authors wrote. And we must underline the fact that it was not a big avalanche, they just got scared, so there wouldn't have been signs of a big avalanche kilometers wide, just over the tent, enough to scare the bejesus out of them. The fact that Soviet authorities were so reticent about sharing details also left the door open for conspiracy theories to emerge. Gom, for one, is a cross-country skier and understood why relatives of the deceased might have been particularly upset. His theory, after all, implied that the hikers had perished as a result of their own errors, despite being seasoned athletes.